Ready? Yeah, good. Shh. Okay, I missed saying who last episode was Lila Nishmas, so hang on. Thank you, Dovi. Last week's share was sponsored Lila Nishmas, my grandmother actually, by my uncle, Shalom Espas Yosef, and her Neshama Shev and Aliyah. I just wanted to mention that. Now this week's share is sponsored Lila Nishmas, Rachel Chaya Bashimon and Chaim Kalman Ben Dov, their Neshama Shev and Aliyah. Now, without further ado, I want to talk about really, really an exceptional fight that happened in the 1500s. We have to do a little background, though, first. Background, first of all, on the sugya, what Nezirus we're exactly discussing. We spoke last week about Nazir, so we'll bring us back up to speed again, and then we have to talk about what this fight took place about. So now, I'm going to do the what, the non-halachic what, before the halachic what. So the non-halachic what is as follows. In Egypt, between the years, give or take, let's say from 1,000 to 1,500, those 500 years, there was an institution that was in Egypt that was nowhere else at that time. It was called the Negidus, meaning the leader of the Egyptian Jewish community, of the Frum community, was called the Nagid. Now, this is something that there was Negidim of sorts in Bavel, back when Yidden lived in Bavel, but eventually the Jewish community in Bavel dissipated. There was no more Yidden living there. And they were really called the Reish Gelus over there. It was a bit of a different name. But there was something called the Nagid in Egypt. Now, Nagid essentially was what a Reish Gelusa was, what a Nasi was, what a leader of, call it a he wasn't the rabbi. He was an Askin leader of the Jewish community. Now, the way it actually started is Egypt came under Islamic rule in give or take that period, Barach 950. And then there was a bunch of dynasties, like they were called caliphs, which is a Islamic king, a religious Islamic king. And there was the Mamluk dynasty. There was a bunch of different dynasties, and the caliphs of each one of them, led the country. Now, the first Egyptian caliph, whose name is not so clear what it was, in give or take the year 975, he was mishadach with a Babylonian family. He married an Iraqi, essentially an Iraqi girl, who was from an Iraqi royal family, the Caliph of Iraq. And when she came to Egypt to live in his household, she says, it looks like there's a lot of Jews over here. This was in Kahir, which was old Cairo. Looks like there's a lot of Jews over here. What sort of systems or structures do you have implemented to control your Jews? Like, how do you manage your Jews? And the Caliph of Egypt said, I don't really have a management system for my Jews. My Jews just live here. She said, because back at home where I come from in Iraq, we have something called, I think the Arabic word was Ras al-Yehud, which means like the leader of the Jews, Ras al-Yehud. And she says, it's someone who's called Dawidi, which is an anical of the base David HaMelech, like someone who came from the family of David HaMelech. And we appoint someone from that family to be Ras al-Yehud, and like they're our interlocutor between the Caliph and the Jewish Kehillah. And he says, this sounds like a great idea. Maybe you could get me one of these Davidi Jews from Iraq. And she says, yeah, sure, we'll try to import you one. And they import a family of Davidi Jews from Iraq to be the Nagid, which is what it became called in our language, but the Ras al-Yehud for the Jews of Egypt. Now, it's unclear if these mishpachas were actually Enikach of David HaMelech. That's not clear. It's also unclear if the family that started the Negidus in Egypt actually came from Iraq. That's also, a lot of this is shrouded in mystery. But over the 500 years that the Negidus was a thing in Egypt, it's mentioned dozens of times in different shuvas, meaning many paiskim, many shilas that came up, dozens of times the institution of the Nagid is mentioned in shuvas throughout this tkufa in Egypt, and it played a big role in the whole society, the Egyptian Frum society of the time. Now, Stam, because it's interesting, I'll just share this, but the first Nagid of Egypt was someone by the name of Reb Paltiel, it seems. Reb Paltiel, his great grandson writes a sefer eventually about the family's history. So they were certainly miyuchasim, they were certainly a chashuv family. It's called Megillas Achimotz, I think. He was Achimotz ben Paltiel, like a few days later. And he writes the story as follows, I think, that his grandfather Paltiel was actually from Bari, which is a city in Italy, and as was common in those days, was captured by pirates. He ends up being sold to an Egyptian family, and he was living by a prominent Egyptian doctor in Cairo. Now, this Egyptian doctor was the doctor for the caliph, for the sultan, for taking care of him. And every time the caliph had something that ailed him, he would come to this Jewish doctor, and he would get whatever he needs. And the adopting father was getting elderly, and he fell ill. And the caliph comes knocking on the door, and he says, are you able to call your father? I need help. Something hurts me. Something's bothering me. And the kid went to the room where his father was laying ill, his adoptive father, and his adoptive father was out of it. He wasn't able to help him anything. And the kid gave his own medical advice. He was a bright kid. He was a precocious kid. He had been in his father's household. Supposedly he was 10 or 11 years old at this point, and he dispensed his own medical advice to the caliph. Now the caliph assumed that the medical advice came from the father who was laying ill in the back room, so he took it. 2 weeks later he comes back, and at this point the doctor had already died, and he says, call your father. He says, oh, my father's dead, but I'll tell you what to do. You could do X, Y, and Z. And the caliph starts laughing. What, a child's going to tell me what to do? He says, no, last time also when you came, it was me who told you what to do. It wasn't my father. Really, he gives him a quiz. He sees he's this, incredible child prodigy, this genius, and he has him sent to all the proper schools and brought up to speed in, all the chachmas of the day. And this child grows into Reb Paltiel, who's the first nugget of Egypt. This is the legend. Now, this legend, certainly the first part of the legend, that the shidduch between an Iraqi, Islamic Iraqi girl and an Egyptian king produced the first nugget, that the Radvaz in the Tshuva brings down. It's not just that the Radvaz in the Tshuva and Chelik Aleph brings down this story. Terch Dibur, while he's talking about a nugget, he mentions this, the history of nugget. The fact that it was a Paltiel and this exact thing comes from this other story, from this other book, from the Mishpachas Paltiel's Yichus. So do what you want with it. These are legends. It's hard to know exactly what happened and who the people were. Sometimes he's referred to, the Nugget Rishon is called Rav Pliny, which is not anybody, it just means the Nugget, the guy, Rav Pliny. Other Svarim, they call him Rav Paltiel, so it could be one of them is a mistake. Either Pliny's a mistake or Paltiel's a mistake, so pick your poison. You know what I'm saying? It is what it is. This is the legend like upon him of the Negidus in Egypt. Now, why am I talking about this? Because the last Nugget in Egypt, the last family of Negidim, the last Nugget of Egypt was someone by the name of Yitzchak Shteller. Yitzchak Shteller was a Talmud Chacham. He's musker in many chuvas. The Beis Yosef actually in Archaim and Siman Nun Aleph in a Shaila of Hilchos Tefillah brings down a psak from Yitzchak Shteller. The Radvaz learned by him and quotes him several times in his Svarim. Many other, the Shita Mekubetzes was a Talmud of his. He was the last nugget. He was not an Amoritz by any stretch, clearly, but he was the leader of the Jews over there. And Yitzchak Shteller came from the Chashav Sholel family that produced several Negidim, meaning they tended to be that Negidus went like in a family line. Once one person was Zeich in it, some of his children would get it. Lamashal, the Rambam, who was the Gadol Adar of Egypt, was not a Nugget, but his son Reb Avram was a Nugget, and his son Reb David was, and his son Reb Avram was, and his son, Uchena V'chena, like I think for almost 200 years, the Rambam's Mishpacha was the Negidim. So Negidus went, by family lineage. So the Sholel family was the last installment of the Negidus in Egypt was the Sholel family. Now Yitzchak Shteller was a Talmud Chacham. He was an opinionated person, a strong-minded person. And Ma'aseh Shahaya Kachaya. This you'll see that this is the story in many different chuvas that it comes up in. Ma'aseh Shahaya Kachaya. There was a dayan in Egypt at the time who was nominated to be the Av Bezdin of Egypt, so to speak. He was a young dayan, a young Talmud Chacham, who was nominated to be the Av Bezdin. Rabbi Yitzchak Shteller Me'ezet HaMashiach was strongly opposed to his candidacy. We don't know why. We don't know anything now. We don't know any names. We don't know anything. We don't know why he was opposed. Yitzchak Shteller, and this is indicative of what the time period was and how people talked in the day, said, if so-and-so, he says, if Shimon, this dayan, is going to be appointed to be the Av Bezdin, I am going to be a Nazir Shimshon forever. I'm going to be a Nazir Shimshon, is what he said. Now, this is indicative of the way that people would trade in Nezirus back in the day. Meaning, although we said last week that currently and in the modern era it's very rare and it's usually very eccentric and unique people who do it, clearly back in the day in Egypt and Eretz Yisrael in those areas in that Tkufa, Nezirus was much more common. So Yitzchak Shteller was a Talmud Chacham who knew what he was doing, was not an Amoritz, was not confused, who knew what he was doing, got up and said, if Pliny becomes the Bezdin, I'm gonna be a Nazir. Now, that didn't mean that he wanted to be a Nazir. That meant I'm such a prominent person, and of course it's unheard of that I'm going to be a Nazir, so you're going to have to bend to my will. I mean, you're not going to, this is a way of forcing everybody to bend, to take a knee, to bend to what he wants. Now, this is what he said. Okay, they took it very seriously. He was the Nugget of Egypt, and they conducted a search party. They sent, shluchim all over the known, find a new dayan. Everybody they fahered, nobody came close to the dayan, this Shimon, who Yitzchak Shteller was strongly opposed to. We still don't know who it is. Nobody came close to this Mar Pliny Shimon the dayan who was the meduber over here. Nobody came close to him. Now Rabbi Yitzchak Shteller is presented with a problem. He says, okay, fine, I realize I'm wrong. I made a mistake. Shimon is by far the best qualified candidate for this job. And he deserves to have this job. The city deserves to have him. He deserves to have the job. My hisnagdus deserves to be withdrawn. But what can I do? I set in place a trigger that the minute he becomes a dayan, I become a Nazir Shimshon. And that's very problematic. What's to do? How do we aleidik this? And vayishleach svarim to every different paisik, to all the gedolim, and there's chuvas about this in the Radvaz, in Rabbi Yosef Teitzak, in the Re'aim, in the Maribei Rav, in Reb Levi Ibn Chabit. Like, it's an endless amount of chuvas that are written about this. Some of them wrote whole contrasim about the Indian, and it was a fight. It was a stormy fight with many sides back and forth. Now, before we go into the pratim of the shaila and surprisingly who the person is, I just want to give a little background to what a Nezirus Shimshon is. So basically, as follows: for simplicity's sake, there's three types of Nezirus. There's Nezirus that's a time Nezirus. You could be Makabel Nezirus for a set amount of time, for 30 days, for 60 days, for 100 days, for whatever you want. That's Nezirus. You Makabel it when your term is up. You bring your karbanis and you go on with your life as it was. Then there's something called a Nazir Olam. A Nazir Olam is someone who's Makabel Nezirus Olam. There's no outs. You're going to be a Nazir till the day you die. You're not allowed to drink wine. You're not allowed to be Metamel Mesim. But there is one kula. The halach is that he's mekel betar once every 12 months. He's allowed to trim his hair, even with a razor, once every 12 months. So, you just don't drink wine, which is an aesthetic thing to do. You don't become tamil mesim, which is why we said last week the Rambam holds we have to go to Eretz Yisrael because Chutz La'aretz is tamei on its own, and the Ravid says you can't even do it because Chutz La'aretz is tamei on its own. So we spoke about that. That's a Nazir Olam. Now that is something that people don't traditionally do because Tumas Mesim is very hard to get around in today's modern era. We're all Tmei Mesim. There's Tmeim all over. There's no Efer Para, meaning it's very impractical to be makabel something that requires you to stay away from being a Tamei Meis. Okay, so that's not so common. Now the third type is called the Nazir Shimshon. Now Nazir Shimshon is unique. A Nazir Shimshon, I want to read for the Rambam. The Rambam says as follows. Nazir Shimshon, for starters, as follows. Shimshon, we know Shimshon's story. Shimshon himself was never makabel Nezirus. It doesn't say anywhere in the pasuk that Shimshon was makabel Nezirus. Shimshon was born a Nazir. The Malach comes to his parents, to his mother, and then later to his father, and she says, Hashem says, I'm going to give you a child, and this child should be raised as a Nazir. Possibly Manoach was a Nazir as well, according to some. It doesn't say anywhere that Shimshon was makabel Nazirus. Nishnor them, the prate dinim of a Nazir Shimshon, it doesn't say anywhere. It's just all based on inferences from the pasuk, based on the diyukim of how the pasuk describes Shimshon's life over 5 prakim in Shoftim. We know what a Nazir Shimshon looks like because Shimshon stuck to X amount of rules. So says the Rambam based on this. The Rambam says like this in Halacha Gimel in Parakid Gimel Nechus Nezirus. The Rambam says Shimshon lo hay Nazir Gomer. Shimshon wasn't a full Nazir. Sharei lo nader b'Nazir. He never accepted Nazirus. Allah hamalach afrisha min atumah. V'keitzad hayadina. What was his din? Haya aser b'yayin. Okay, now this is important. He was aser to drink wine. Aser b'taglachas. Umutar haya le'tamel lemesim. V'davar zeh he kabbalah humpia kabbalah. So the Rambam says Shimshon has like a different kula. Shimshon is allowed to metamel mesim, so that makes Shimshon very suitable for the modern era. Meaning, when there's tumah is not a problem, fine. Shimshon tumah is not a problem because we know Shimshon killed people in the thousands, in the droves. Like the Maral Bach writes in a tshuva, if you're going to tell me that a Nazir Shimshon should be aser in tumah, Shimshon is practically still killing people. He says va'oidiyad netuya. Shimshon was such a prolific killer. He's practically still killing people. So that's a humorous way of saying it's impossible to conjure a world where Shimshon is not allowed to become a Tamil Mesim. So now, but Shimshon has a chumrah that he's never allowed to trim his hair. So someone who's going to be in Nazir Shimshon is going to have very long hair. That's going to be a feature of his Nazirus. And this is a very important detail, is the Poskim say, and this is mashma like this from the Gemara, it's not exactly clear, but it's mashma like this Gemara, that a Nazir Shimshon has another tremendous chumrah, is that it's not nitin l'she'ela. A lot of Nidarim, you could be shayl on the nether. You could have a hatara for the nether. A Nazir Shimshon, the nether of a Nazir Shimshon has no she'ela. So this is I'm just saying this to set the stakes. When Rabbi Yitzchak Shteller says that if it doesn't go my way in this election process for the Ab Bezdin of Egypt, I'm going to become a Nazir Shimshon, the stakes are very high. There's no way out. This is permanent. This is for life. He's going to have to grow his hair, all the way down to here. And let's assume he was someone who was commonplace in the halls of power. He interacted with all the government officials. He had to look presentable. The stakes were very high for him to be a Nazir Shimshon. Now, so the shilas go out to all the different rabbanim, to many different poskim. Now, the posik, a young posik who lived in Egypt at the time, was 2 of them actually. One of them was the Maribei Rav, Yaakov Bey Rav, who ultimately later on, what happens to Egypt is in 1515, what happens is the Ottomans take over. The Ottoman Empire takes over, becomes very inhospitable to the Jews, and Rabbi Yitzchak Shteller moves to Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, whose psak I'm going to tell you in a second, moves to Eretz Yisrael. The Marobach and his father, whose psak I'm going to say in a second, moved to Eretz Yisrael. This whole kehila of Egyptian Jews who are involved in this fight end up all migrating to Eretz Yisrael. They disperse to all different areas. Rabbi Beirav goes to live in Sfas. The Marobach lives in Yerushalayim, etc., etc. You know, Chayna v'Chayna. Now, Yech Shia, the Rabbi Beirav has a psak as follows. Rabbi Beirav is approached with this question. He's a young Talmud Chacham living in Egypt at the time, and he suggests a very mechudishtik idea that he wants to take to the bank that receives a lot of pushback, and that's as follows. There's a Gemara, a Mishnah in Nazir. The Mishnah on Davdal says as follows, and it's interesting Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Ha'omer hareini k'shimshin. Someone says, I'm like Shimshin, or hareini I'll read you the Mishnah in 1 second. The Mishnah says on Nazir Davdal as follows, hareini k'shimshin. Someone says, I'm like Shimshin. Or he says, Kiben Manayach, I'm like the son of Manayach. Or Kibal Dalila, like the husband of Dalila. Or Kamisha Akar Dalsis Aza. Or Kamisha Nakru Plishtim Esainav. Harez Nazir Shimshin. The Gemara gives 5 hatfasis, 5 things that were famous, that were now known things about Shimshin. It says, if a person says any one of these 5 things, he's a Nazir Shimshin. Now the Gemara right away, it's a small Gemara. The Gemara says, Lamali Misni Kol Halin. What do you need all these redundant ways of saying it? The Gemara says, Tzrichi. The Yomar Hareini K'Shimshin, have a mina Shimshin Achrin. If you just said I'm like Shimshin, there's a lot of Shimshins in the world. Maybe he meant a different Shimshin. Kamash Malon, Keben Menayach, Vitana Keben Menayach, have a mina Ikademiskri Hachi. There's a Shimshin Keben Menayach. Again, that wouldn't be so Kamash Malon. Kebal Dalila, Commission Arkablishim Mesainav, so you have to say all the rest. And that's what the Gemara says. Now the pashtus of the Gemara seems to be saying that if someone says Hareini K'Shimshin, it's not enough. Someone says I'm like Shimshin, okay, that's a little bit obscure. I don't know who's Shimshin. I know Shimshin, you know Shimshin, there's a lot of Shimshins. What does that have to do with being a Nazir? No, you have to layer on, you have to say, Kebal Dalila, Keben Menayach. So says the Rabbi Beirav, and he brings very interesting, actually, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but he brings a Machlekes Rishonim, what the gears in the Mishnah is. Some Rishonim say that the first 3 cases, Hareini K'Shimshin, Kebal Menayach, Keben Menayach, Kebal Dalila, there's no vavs. It just says Keben, Keben, Keben. 3 cases. The last 2 cases of Kamisha Akru, the Einav, and that, it says Oy, like a vi, Kamisha Akru, or vi. So says the Rabbi Beirav, the first 3 are non-negotiable. And he says the Gemara also only goes into the tzrichas of the first 3. If you want to be a Nazir Shimshin, you have to say Kishimshin, Ben Menayach, Baal Dalila. Otherwise, it's not clear enough who you meant, it's not clear what you meant exactly, and that's not, your Nezirus is not going to be chal. And he brings the Rosh's Girsha, the Mefarish's Girsha. Now it's a big Machlekes Rishonim, because some Rishonim don't have that Girsha, and the Tshuva is a long Tshuva, it's a 10-page Tshuva in the Mirab. But essentially, when you narrow down the crux of what the Mirab is being Saimachan, he's being Saimachan on this Chiddush, that he's learning the Mishnah, that based on the way he's learning the Mishnah, and based on the Girsha in the Mishnah means to say, you're only a Nazir Shimshin if you very specifically say which Shimshin you were referring to. So says the Rabbi Beirav, you, Rabbi Yitzchak Sholel, although you made this threat, wantonly, and you shouldn't have spoken that way, but at the end of the day, you didn't say the components that are necessary to say it. And in Nezirus, in Nidarim B'chlal, the din is, it has to be B'davar HaNadar. You have to say another in the proper way with something that another can be chal. You didn't do that, so your Nezirus is not chal. Now the Rabbi Rav, for whatever reason, was a little bit unconfident in this psak. We might find out why. He's a little bit unconfident in this psak. And he sent his psak to Rabbi Leo Mizrahi, who was the Rav of Izmir, Turkey, to review the psak. He sent it, please, if you don't mind, review my psak and tell me what you think. Now, Rabbi Leo Mizrahi wrote back, I hear what you're saying in some Rishonim, Lamaisa, the Rambam. And I'll read you the Rambam. The Rambam says as follows. The Rambam says, Lefichach, Misha Amar Hareini Nazir Kishimshin. Harezi Nazir Menayayin, fine, that's it. Okay, now here. Ha'imar Hareini Kishimshin, Kiben Menayach, Kebal Dalila, Kimisha Akar Dal Sizaza, Kimisha Naku Plishtim Asainav, Harezi Nazir Kinazir Shimshin. The Rambam says, even though these things could have happened to another person, if you say these things, you're a Nazir. Now the Rambam seems to be saying any one of them. The Rambam doesn't say you have to say all 3 of them. The Rambam's a halacha sefer. The Rambam's not bringing the Gemara. The Rambam's not the Mishnah. The Rambam, you don't say tzricha says in the Rambam. Why the Rambam say all of them? The Rambam's bringing halacha l'maisa. The Rambam says clearly, if you say any one of these 5 things, even though some of these 5 things could have been things that happened to other people, meaning they're not so conclusive, you're a Nazir right away, because everybody knows what you mean. Everybody knows who Shimshin is. Everybody knows what you mean. You know what you mean. Everybody knows what you mean. This is called the Davar Another. So says the Rabbi Leo Mizrahi, the Re'im, I'm not masking. Maybe you're right. You have a Rosh that's mashma like that, or you have a Mefarish that's mashma like that. But Lamaisa, the Rambam, who's the Baal Halacha, who wrote on this inyan, meaning most Paiskim, it's not in Shulchan Aruch, like we said last week. The Shulchan Aruch didn't even exist yet at this time, actually, but it's not in Shulchan Aruch. But this is the Mechab. This is what the Rambam says, and mainly you can negate the Rambam and Ritzchel has to be Noyeg Nezirus. Now, they sent the shout out to other people. Lamashal, the Marabach's father, Rabbi Yaakov ibn Chabiv, they sent him the Shaila. He wrote a whole kuntres about it, and he did more. Not only did he write a kuntres about the psak, he wrote a private letter to Rabbi Shteller where he wrote to him, I've seen the tzadim lahakal, meaning I'm aware that what I'm saying is the chumrah. I've seen the tzadim lahakal. Lamaisa, someone like you on your Madrega, who's a Talmud Chacham and a good Yid, I wouldn't be semach on these kulas. Meaning he appealed personally to Rabbi Shteller not to be semach on these kulas. Like these are weak kulas, don't be semach on them. Now, so what was the safe davar? Other poskim got involved. Rabbi Yosef Teitzak, who was today came out an unknown person, but at that time was considered from the Gedolei Hadar. Rabbi Yosef Teitzak, he got involved. I don't think we have his tshuva, but we have other people who quote him. Rabbi Yosef Teitzak agreed with the Rabbi Rav, and he was semach on it. And it seems, it's not 100% clear, but it seems that Rabbi Shteller was not noeg Nezirus. He was semach on the psak of the Rabbi Rav and the Mari Teitzak, and he was makel to not be noeg like a Nazir, based on this interpretation of the Gemara, and not like the strict reading of the Rambam. Now, if you want to see all the back and forth, you can take a look at the Kesef Mishnah and Perek Gimel over here in Hilchos Nezirus and Halacha Yadalad. Kesef Mishnah brings all the back and forth. The Kesef Mishnah, which is the Beis Yosef, was actually a Talmud of the Rabbi Rav. So he favors his Rebbe's psak, the Rabbi Rav's kula. He definitely favors that psak. Even he does all the gerrymandering that's needed to make all the Rambam shtem over here. He favors that psak strongly. It doesn't make the Shulchan Aruch obviously, but he favors that psak, and that it seems to be was what carried the day. Now, here's a plot twist, and this is something that's very interesting. Why was the Rabbi Rav not confident to make this psak on his own? Why did he send this shaila to the Rabbi Leo Mizrahi in Izmir to paskin the shaila? Well, what was this? Now, 60 years ago, they published a sefer al Rambam called Beis Yaakov from Rabbi Yaakov Beirav from the Rabbi Rav. It was a sefer that was known that it existed, but it was never published for some reason. The Chida writes that he'd seen it. We knew that it existed, but it was never published. And what it is basically the Rabbi Rav decided to write a pirush on the Rambam for every place where there's no Magid Mishnah. He didn't write over, his own pirush in the whole Rambam. It's a smaller sefer. Any place where the Magid Mishnah isn't, he is. And in his sefer, in Hilchos Nezirus, in Perek Gimel, Halacha Yud Gimel, which is the parak that this is Negeya, he writes as follows, and I want to read it for you. And this might explain his reticence to paskin the shaila. He says as follows: Bizman hanogid, Rabbi Yitzchak Sholel Zatzal, halacha lamaisa shenadar ben Nezirus Shimshon Shaleli is dayan kozman sheyehu nogid. He made a neder not to be the dayan, not that I can't be the dayan as long as he's the nogid. This was very personal. The dayan in question over here was the Rabbi Rav, who later on, I don't know what his stature was at the time, later on goes on to be considered the Gadol Hadar. Because when the Smicha controversy, which is something we should get to eventually erupts in Eretz Yisrael, the first person that all the contemporary Gedolim choose to be Masmich is the Rabbi Rav. So he goes on to become literally the Gadol Hadar in Eretz Yisrael. But he was the Dayan, who was in question over here, and Rabbi Yitzchak Sholel was saying he's going to become an Nazir. And he says, V'achar zeh, chila pana, he came begging me, she'avakesh ezet tzad heter, lachzor li es Dayan, that I could return to my Dayanis. He came begging me that I should come up with some sort of mechanism that he could pattern himself from this neder that's sitting on his shoulder, this monkey on his shoulders, and I could go back to being the Dayan. He couldn't find anybody who was more worthy than me for the Shteller. And for him, this was like he couldn't get out of this. This is a predicament he couldn't escape from. Because of all this begging, then he says his kula. Tasi kamarayis. He says and I wasn't willing to be semich l'maisa halacha l'maisa on my own psak. So Mela, I sent it out to others, and the fight develops how it develops. So just a wild detail is that this fight, I was trying to think of like a contemporary mashal of what this could be. It's like, you have to think it would be like, I don't know, for lack of a better example, like Moshe Sher saying, I'm going to be a Nazir if they put Moshe on the Me'atzes. It was like something like so strange, something so outlandish that had to be it had to be figured out. I mean, you couldn't like this, it just couldn't work. This is how the Rabbi Rav is describing the case and the fight that happened to him. Now, I just want to say one little piece of historical fiction, and then I'll end off with this. I think it's historical fiction, l'chayr, but it's interesting to me. Rabbi Yitzchak Sholel goes to Eretz Yisrael. As far as I could tell, he wasn't noeg ben Nezirus at the end of the day. He goes to Eretz Yisrael in 1515, and a terrible magefa breaks out in Eretz Yisrael. He lives in Yerushalayim at the time. Yerushalayim was tzafuf, it was poor, it was dirty, and to try to avoid dying from the magefa, he goes on the road. B'shas magefa pazer ragelcha, go run away. He goes to run away. It's unclear where he goes. He goes to a mountaintop somewhere. He tries to ride out the magefa over there. Ultimately, he is unsuccessful. The magefa catches up with him over there, and Yitzchak Sholel dies shortly after that in 1515. A relatively young man still, in a mountain somewhere in the Izor of Yerushalayim, outside of Yerushalayim, where he ran away to escape the Magefa. We know of this because the Marabach, who was also involved in the previous argument of Nezirus, is the executor of his will. In Tshuva Tzaddik Hey, in Shut Marabach, is a tshuva about divvying up the will, the estate of Yitzchak Shteller. He has instructions for Yitzchak Sheller's wife, for his young child. It's a fascinating tshuva. He tells her not to get married right away, take a few years to raise this child, then get married again. It's a very interesting tshuva. But we know about this from this tshuva in the Marabach. Now, like about 50, 60 years ago, someone tried to figure out where Yitzchak Shteller is buried. Where is this mountaintop? Yitzchak ben Tzvi, the former prime minister, president of Israel, was a shtickle chacham. He wrote about it in one of the, like a ksaves that I saw on Yitzchak Chachma, and he tried to figure it out based on references. I don't know if I'm convinced by his arguments, but what he concluded is that Yitzchak Shteller escaped to the area of Nabi Samuel, which is where Shmuel Navi is buried. Today we know where that is. You could go there to Shmuel Navi's kever. It's actually a big pilgrimage site. Whatever, people go there all the time. He escaped to a mountain in that area, about less than a kilometer away from Shmuel Navi's kever, and there he tried to hide out in a small, cottage. L'maisa, it's an Ish Gelungen, and he caught the plague and he died also. Now, so that might be historical fiction on its own. Here's another detail of historical fiction. I came across, brought down in Seder Nezirus, that there's an alta minig, that it's a psak or halacha minig, that in the area of Kever Shmuel Navi, you're not allowed to drink wine or eat grapes. Why? Because the Mishnah Nazir in the 9th parak says that Shmuel Navi was a Nazir, and the Rambam paskins like this in Halach Tazayin, right here the Rambam says, Shmuel Ramasi Nazir Olam Haya, Shmuel Navi was a Nazir, Lefichach, whatever, the Rambam brings it for what he brings it for. So there was a minig or a halacha, however you want to refer to it, that you have to be noyig some sort of Nazirus in Shmuel Navi's presence. Like you're not allowed to eat grapes or drink wine in Shmuel Navi's presence. Now, to me it's just ironic that the non-Nazir ends up buried samuch v'nira to Shmuel Navi, who was a Nazir who Kilo casts a long shadow that around his kever you have to be noyig Nezirus. It's an ironic tidbit of historical fiction. It's historical fiction for another detail also, because Pashtus, if you look at other sources, the reason why they didn't drink wine and stuff by Shmuel Navi's kever is because it was a pilgrimage site and the Elam got vild. It turned into like a rave. If you look, there's a sefer from Moshe Basula, who was an Italian Paisik who ends up making immigration. He writes that the Elam by Shmuel Navi gets out of control, and therefore, takana mi'anshi Yerushalayim, not to drink wine over there. So Pashtus has nothing to do with Nezirus, it has nothing to do with anything, but I thought that it's an ironic ending to this story. Okay, to be continued.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.